Thank you all for coming. I was afraid that no one was actually going to come to a talk on capitalism. So, but as Sue is talking about, this is based on the book of the same title that will be published by Routledge sometime early next year. And so today what I'm going to be talking about is not just the discourses of capitalism, but really kind of framing it right from the beginning, this idea of important directions for critical pedagogy. What's been called critical pedagogy, of course, has been contested among many scholars for many decades now. But I would say briefly the definition of a critical pedagogy is to engage with the power of meaning makings in our society. Who controls the meanings? How are meanings taken up and mediated by people in everyday society? And then recently, in the last 5 to 10 years or so, there's been another branch associated with critical pedagogy, which has been called public pedagogy, which I'll be talking about. And public pedagogy is really looking at educational sites outside of the classroom. And of course, with the rise of social media and so forth, there are ample opportunities for critical public pedagogy engagements with how people take up discourses ranging from gender, class, racial issues, and so forth. And so just not within our own students or our classrooms, but with the public at large, can educators and academics engage on a broader level with the general public. So that should be seen through that prism of today's talk. All right, so let's get through a little background first. So once again, we've had another economic crisis that's been ongoing. Now, I know in Australia here, you guys have been largely unaffected, which was a good thing, in 2007. But of course, the rest of the world went through a major economic crisis in 2007. And that was about the 15th one in the last 30 years. And so since the ongoing crisis that's been prevalent in the United States, which I'm from, and I'll be mainly talking about because obviously that's a society I'm most familiar, millions have been affected while politicians and economists, pundits, and so forth still continue to debate. And I think we've seen that highlighted in many dramatic ways with the U.S. presidential election this year. However, there's been one real positive outcome, and it's really given an opportunity for people, and again, going back to the online spaces, for everyday people to really start to discuss the economy and how it's affected them in their everyday lives. And so Philip Morosky, who's written about this, has said that it seemed like everyone with a web browser harbored a quick opinion about what had gone wrong with economics and was not at all shy about broadcasting it to the world. So again, there's these spaces of not only just social media, but readers' comments on newspapers around the world, like New York Times, in which people are engaging now with authorial voices, usually privileged to commentators such as like Paul Krugman, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, who writes about the economy, and where readers are able to kind of engage and debate with his viewpoints as well as others. However, many economists have dismissed a lot of the comments by the general public, kind of saying, well, it's really, they're ill-informed. Many of them have never taken an economics course, and had really kind of, some of them have gone so far, usually on the right side of things, that their illiteracy has actually contributed to their own financial misfortunes. Okay, and I think this is kind of a prevalent discourse among many mainstream economists, that the everyday knowledge of the economy is neither scientific nor grounded in so-called correct theories. Okay, now this of course raises this important kind of questions for any society calling itself a democracy. There are at least two questions that come to mind, one of which is, first of all, should everyday people have a say in the economic policies affecting their lives? Now, people might argue, it's like, well, they do because they go and vote in so-called democratic countries, but that's another issue. And then another issue would be, are the forms of economic knowledge produced by the general public as valid as those produced by professional economists? We'll see some samples of this. Okay, now, one of the reasons why I'm so interested in this is part of it is my own background. As an undergraduate, I had two degrees, one of which was in economics. And it really kind of stemmed from that. But it was also this idea that the economy plays a central role in our lives, right? And so whether it's the concerns over job security, future employment prospects, falling wages, and again, I'm referencing to the U.S. society, so forgive the kind of almost American-centric, but again, though that's the sample database that I'm most familiar. But in the last 35 years, wages in the United States have stagnated and have actually declined. Okay, and of course, with the student debt in the United States, I know that's that's becoming an issue here. But with the student debt in the United States is now over $1 trillion US. So I think it's crucial to understand really how and why people make sense of the economy, and importantly, the possibilities they see in their own agencies in addressing these issues. Now, kind of going back to this, where maybe part of the issue arises that. In American high schools, economics is not a required subject. And in the university, if students do take an economics course, they are coming up against a certain kind of orthodoxy. So James K. Galbraith has written that leading active members of today's economics profession have formed themselves into a kind of Politburo for correct economic thinking. As a general rule, as one might generally expect from a gentleman's club, this has placed them on the wrong side of every important policy issue, and not just recently, but for decades. They predict disaster where none occurs. They deny the possibility of events that then happen. They oppose the most basic, decent, and sensible reforms while offering placebos instead. They are always surprised when something untoward like a recession actually occurs. And when finally they sense that some position cannot be sustained, they do not re-examine their ideas. They do not consider the possibility of a flaw in logic or theory. Rather, they simply change the subject. No one loses face in this club for having been wrong. And it can be really traced back to what happened in the late 70s in the US, where there was a systematic purge of economists who were specializing in methodology and history. Okay, and journals, as you can see, such as the American Economic Review, stopped publications of articles in these research areas, which then, of course, these were used to deny hiring and tenure promotion in universities, since those economists in those fields could no longer get published in the top journals. And so by the 1990s, very few courses in the US remained addressing economic philosophy and history of doctrine. Okay, so the title, of course, the main title of today is Discourses of Capitalism. So what is capitalism? And Richard Wolff, the economist at University of Massachusetts in Amherst, emeritus now, has written that, like all important topics, capitalism has been defined and understood quite differently by different people and groups throughout its history. Okay, so one of the dominant themes about capitalism in the mainstream media, and we hear it from politicians when they frame capitalism as the free market. Capitalism is the free market. Capitalism is private enterprise, right? Capitalism is democracy. Capitalism is the freedom to create whatever business you want. However, if you look at the histories of economic arrangements such as slavery and feudalism, in fact, they also relied on free markets. In feudalistic times, there were free markets. They were able to set their own prices, okay? They were able to sell the goods whenever and wherever. Private enterprise, it was a similar manner. So, in fact, private enterprise and free markets are not specific or unique to capitalism only. So, if those two are not unique to capitalism, what actually defines capitalism? The definition I'm going to be using in addressing how people take up the discourses is that it's the class structure of production of surplus value produced by workers, which is then appropriated and distributed by capitalists. Now, what does surplus value mean? So, for example, on a usual or typical in the Western world, eight-hour working day, okay, we get paid, yes, we get paid for, we feel like we get paid for 8 hours, right? But in fact, what we're producing, okay, for the 8 hours of pay is actually we produce in 4 hours. So those extra 4 hours that we're producing, we're not getting paid. that is what the surplus value. So in other words, that's what the businesses call profits, right? But businesses are in business not just to break even, but to make a profit. And their profit lies into the surplus value that we actually produce. We actually produce much more than we're actually getting paid in return. Now, but there's a second part of that equation, which is that that surplus then is appropriated from the workers, from us, without us having a democratic say in deciding how that surplus should be redistributed back to us in the form of bonuses or higher pay. No, it's appropriated from us. We don't have the decision. That decision is usually within the board of directors, right, or the CEO. And then that is also distributed throughout the rest. So it's either distributed through different forms of channel, whether it's to the government, to rent, and so forth. When I explained this definition to my graduate students back at Sydney University of Hong Kong, where many of them were from mainland China, one of them said, "That sounds like a dictatorship to me." So then, who is a capitalist? There's a lot of debate around calling people certain capitalists. For example, like my father, who owned a small restaurant with several other partners, was he a capitalist? There is a working definition of who are the capitalists, and according to the economist at the University of Notre Dame, David Ruccio, has said that there's actually a core group of capitalists in the United States numbering no more than 6,000, and they sit on the boards of directors of the corporations. And so he identifies them as the capitalists, these people who are actually deciding the overwhelming majority of the surplus value produced by workers. Which brings us to the question of ideology. If we all have different ideas about what capitalism is, why is that? There are certain other words that, of course, that I think we would agree on the definition. For example, maybe a chair, we would agree that it is an object upon which to sit or stand, whatever you feel comfortable with, right? However, capitalism might be classified as what Raymond Williams has talked about as a key word. And a key word has had many contested ideological meanings throughout its history, and of course, thus used differently. Capitalism is no different. And this idea of viewing capitalism through the prism of so-called ideology, which is that part of the problem is if we're addressing any kind of critique of capitalism, we first have to define what kind of ideologies we're using. Now that brings the whole issue that Terry Eagleton has talked about and others, that there are many competing definitions of ideology. So when we do talk about ideology, what ideology are we talking about? Which one, rather? So he lists several current definitions, as you can see. Okay, the second one, which was kind of attributed to Marx and Engels in the beginning, but of course their ideas were more complex than that have been traditionally been represented. Okay, this idea of kind of a false consciousness, which I'll be talking about in a bit. Okay. Okay, and the last several, as you know, they've been quite popular in terms of how this the idea of discourse has been taken up in the last 40 years or so in the post-structuralists. Okay. Now, the philosopher Flavio JeanJacques has pointed out, though, there exists an important gap in our everyday ideological horizon, this idea that. So he says, for example, the gap between real knowledge and symbolic belief determines our everyday ideological attitude. So he cites the familiar psychological experience of commenting on something that is so horrific and traumatic that we say, I know that is so, but nevertheless I can't believe it. Right, so something where something huge event would happen, would be something like 9/11 would be like, well, I know that happened, but I really can't believe those twin towers fell down. And so that could be almost equatable to this idea that I know there is no economic justice in the world, but nevertheless I'll live my life as if I can't believe it. Okay. Now, this is the idea of whose ideology, right? So, and this is something that I addressed in my book, that Stuart Hall has talked about for those who possess the true scientific knowledge that enables them to recognize the real. It's always other people, never ourselves, who are in false consciousness, who are bewitched by the dominant ideology. What I call the matrix view of ideology. If you remember that film with Keanu Reeves in 1999, where Morpheus, tells Neo, there's this whole subterranean world out there, and there's a seminal moment, that Neo realizes it, and he puts on these sunglasses, and he sees how the workings of the world, right? That is the kind of matrix view of ideology. Now, this idea, though, that the fundamental stratagems of ideology is that some kind of reference to some self-evidence, right? Look, you can see for yourself how things are, and this is how politicians exactly address their the potential voters. The facts speak for themselves is perhaps the arch statement of ideology. The point, as JeanJacques said, precisely that facts never speak for themselves, but are always made to speak by a network of discursive devices, right? So this idea of false consciousness, again, Stuart Hall has something very important to say when he talks about that is the worker who lives his or her relation to the circuits of capitalist production exclusively through the categories of a fair price and fair wage and false consciousness. Yes, if by that we mean there's something about her situation which she cannot grasp with the category she's using, something about the process as a whole which is systematically hidden because the available concepts only give her a grasp of one of its many-sided moments. No, if by that we mean she is utterly deluded about what goes on under capitalism. And so this is something that I also address in the book, which this was based. This still is from the 1988 Hollywood horror film entitled "They Live" by the filmmaker John Carpenter, who's famous for other horror films like Halloween and so forth. But "They Live" is a story kind of predating the Matrix, which is very interesting, about a character named John Nada. For those of you who know Spanish, Nada means nothing in Spanish. So John Nada is a kind of unemployed construction worker in Los Angeles. And he comes upon a group of rebels who give him a pair of sunglasses, and he puts on these sunglasses, and suddenly he sees things like this. Okay, money, something that we see every day. With his sunglasses, he says, God, what's going on? Advertisements that litter the landscape. Notice I used the verb litter. Obey, consume, conform, right? And so on, okay? Now, what's interesting, though, is that in the film, earlier, one of his friends, as you can see here, the man on the right, one of his friends are having a conversation over lunch, and the friend had talked about why he left Detroit to come to Los Angeles because of the collapse of the auto industry. He was out of work, so he had to come to Los Angeles. And he's quite bitter about it. And he talks about how the auto manufacturers, had basically, promised the workers everything. The workers had done their job, and then the automobile manufacturers gave themselves raises and then shut down the plants. And he tells his friend John Nada, says, what we should do is take a sledgehammer to them, right? And smash their fancy fucking cars. Now, which is interesting, though, is after John Nada comes upon the special magic sunglasses and puts them on and sees the world for how it actually is, then gets into literally a 7-minute street fight with his best friend, trying to force his friend to put on those glasses. Now, what's interesting to me is, since his friend had already seen what was happening in Detroit and knew exactly what was happening, just as Stuart Hall had said, why the struggle for him to put on the sunglasses? Okay, and so I think this is also part of a paradox that we have to address for those of us who are engaged and committed to critical pedagogy, that in fact people do have a sense, do have a knowledge of things that are wrong in the world, but why then don't they take the extra step, okay? Or another, it could be phrased another way is, the classic question is, why do people vote against their own interests? Okay, and in the United States, we've been seeing that, and I know how the media has been framing it, the kind of corporate liberal media framing it, where they'll basically show voters of Donald Trump. I'm sure you've seen the photo that's been gone viral on Facebook and so forth. They focused on this one older white woman, giving the Nazi salute. But she was at a rally of thousands of people, and so far from the photo documentation, she seems to be the only one giving it. I think it'd be quite different if 10,000 people were giving the salute at the same time in lockstep, but she was the only one. So it raises a question of why is she the focus of that? And what is the media kind of ignoring in terms of not only her, but in fact there are many people other than what's been presented in the media as traditional white working class people who are supporting Donald Trump. And in fact, the New York Times actually surveyed and profiled his office in Tampa, Florida, which is an upcoming primary, and many of the volunteers there do not fit in the demographic of white working class. They also include people of Latino heritage, and so when Trump is talking about Mexican immigrants, you know, the reporters are like, well, you're of Latino heritage, why would you be voting for someone who's talking about it? And so I think this is a very interesting kind of thing to explore. And of course, one of the people who had really thought about it in the context of his times was the Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci, who was imprisoned by Benito Mussolini in the 1920s, served 10 years in prison before he died. And he spent his life really kind of thinking about how and why it was that the Italian Communist Party, of which he was a member, collapsed in the face of Mussolini, and how and why fascism took over Italy. And so some of his constructs that he developed, which I use in the book and which I kind of address in terms of how participants take up capitalism, is this idea of common sense. So Gramsci's notion of common sense is not in the same translated meaning in the English usage of like common sense of, you know, don't touch a hot stove, common sense. But it's really as this shared kind of social thought, ways of viewing society, incorporating historically embedded discourses or folklore, philosophy called it, mythologies and common beliefs, okay? Green and Ives have said this common sense embodies a variety of perspectives, often contain elements of truth, but also tend to be disjointed, incoherent, and contradictory. Okay, and this is important, that common sense is not seen as static, but always constantly changing and evolving. Common sense is the site of resistance and struggle, okay? And furthermore, it's to understand the ways in which masses think, conceive the world, and perceive their activity in order to ascertain what elements prevent them from effectively organizing and acting. Now, one example I give to my students about common sense was that, for example, in pre-revolutionary China, for example, 110, 20 years ago or so, my great-grandmother was not able to leave the house more than 10 meters. For the simple reason that her feet were this big because they were bound since birth. But that was an accepted practice among a certain social class in China. When I asked my students from mainland China, my graduate students, I said, well, of the women there, how many of you would accept that as a natural order of things? Of course, no surprise, no one did. And I said, well, see, this is an example of how common sense has obviously changed, right? So it's never fixed in stone, and it's never going to be the way it always is. And so we talked about in terms of this fragmentation of common sense. Within common sense, there's a nucleus called what Gramsci had said, good sense. Okay, and what he says, it is not a question of introducing from scratch a scientific form of thought into everyone's life, but a renovating and making critical an already existing activity. And again, that kind of perhaps goes back to that example of John Nada's friend, in which John Nada had already had that good sense in his outrage about the automobile manufacturing bosses giving themselves raises while shutting down the plants. Okay? And Stuart Hall and O'Shea have talked about this kind of apparently obvious, taken for granted understandings that express a sense of unfairness and injustice about how the world works. And I think this is seen most dramatically in the recent years with those protest movements that was around the world, but also within the United States, both the Occupy movement and the Tea Party. Now, the common sense was mobilized in different directions. If you talk to both people in the Occupy movement and the Tea Party, and I have, both of them were very upset about the economic decline, the loss of jobs, and so forth. But they attributed to different agents. So the Occupy movement, of course, famously came up with the discourse of the 1%. However, the Tea Party targeted President Obama and the government as being the villains. Now, which is interesting is because it's not clear, it's not always cut and dried, right? Because we do know that the government, and to a certain extent President Obama, was complicit with corporate enabling of, and in the past presidents as well, of job loss. Okay, and so this contradictory nature of common sense, as Marcus Green and Peter Ives talks about, is not the product of some sort of intellectual or psychological deficiency on the part of the masses. Rather, it's largely defined by the contradictory nature of the ensemble of social relations, economic exploitations, and various exclusions they produce and reproduce. Okay, so going back to what I began the lecture with on public pedagogy and knowledge, this idea that it's from the perspective of public pedagogy, okay, educational researchers and theorists no longer need to locate the school as epicenter of educational activity. Rather, they view informal and everyday spaces and discourses themselves as innately and pervasively pedagogical. And so this public pedagogy, the aim is really to work at the intersection of education and politics, that is, in the interest of the public condition of plurality. All right, and so let's get to the next part of that subtitle of everyday economists. Who are the everyday economists, as I talked about? And following Klamer and Meehan, I categorize people who talk about the economy, that is, people like you and me, as everyday economists. Okay, and these are people, obviously, who are dealing with issues related in their everyday lives around the economy. And they're most likely to personalize the economy, right, in terms of people doing things right and wrong, okay, victories and defeats, special interests. We've heard about that a lot. And we're all, among all of them, we think in dramatic terms of winners or losers and of power, right? And along with that, there is a lot of interesting work done on this idea of economic representations, understanding how people think about, conceptualize, construct these representations of the economy. Okay, and I think this really raises a central issue of whose representations and voices have heard. Okay, and so again, with social media enabling kind of a counter response to what has been before decades of dominant economic representations in newspapers, for example, and then television on the economy, people were able to kind of talk back in a sense of their own ideas of what the economy is. Okay, so part of that is the idea of public knowledge, okay, which I talked about earlier before, was kind of castigated by mainstream economists as ersatz economics, okay. But this idea that academic economists consider these to be, random set of irrational illocutions, okay. But however, we can examine these economic representations of having their own discursive structure. Okay, so here are some examples of economic representations by everyday economists. Okay. This one I like. This was done. This was from BuzzFeed on students from Korea who were they were just writing about their own futures. This was taken from the Occupy movement. From a famous song. This has been circulating recently, especially with the candidacy of the U.S. presidential candidate Bernie Sanders, who's actually talking about socialism, which historically in the U.S. has been a big no-no for several reasons associated with the Cold War and so forth. Okay, so the man on the right here, Steve Lambert, an artist, created this artwork called Capitalism Works for Me, as you can see, with a voting console where people could just walk up to it and vote true or false. Okay, and then they would have, and it traveled around in Times Square, New York City, Boston. He went to the Midwest in the U.S., Des Moines, Iowa. And then traveled to London. As far as I know, I don't know if he has any plans to come here to Australia, but I should write to him and ask him. And so in addition to having people vote, they interviewed several people who were willing and got their response why they voted true or false. And that's where we're going to see some examples. So and here's the final tally in Times Square. It came to Los Angeles, but unfortunately the city government in Los Angeles, in its infinite wisdom, did not allow it to be publicly displayed on the street. Instead, it went into some art gallery, which I went to. As you can see, this was in 2012. Okay, so let's hear from several of the participants about their views of, does capitalism work for them or not?
Can I comment on the vote that's already been tallied or no? Okay, just want to make sure.
Okay, could you please state your name and tell us about
The equality.
So I know you wanted to comment on the vote. How do you feel about that?
I think it's outrageous that it's even close, let alone that capitalism is losing. I mean, I think that's kind of reflected in what's going on in the country today. You know, that's why we're on this downhill slide. You know, because people don't appreciate the opportunities of capitalism. They would rather live in this world of entitlement and let supposedly somebody else pay. You know, somebody else. But sooner or later you're going to run out of somebody else's.
So you're saying that part of the reason we're in this economic slump is because people don't believe in capitalism and we're trying to do instruments from the government?
But of course, they want to be completely reliant on the government. They want the government to make all kinds of decisions for them. Here in New York, we have a mayor that wants to decide how much soda we could drink. You know, it's really getting that bad. Well, when I voted, it was 409 against capitalism and 360-something for it. And you know, as long as the attitude is like that in this country, we're going to have, you know, major problems. We're going to have. I'm sure if you did the vote in Detroit, which just went bankrupt, it would probably be unanimous against capitalism. But meanwhile, when Detroit was the capital of capitalism, and the auto industry was centered there, and people believed in capitalism, it was a bustling, very rich city. Now, it's like what Hiroshima would have looked like if we were really mad. That's it. Vote for capitalism while you still can vote.
Okay. Wow. And I think this is, he lays out a very interesting argument, right? And we could actually spend several hours talking about it, so I just kind of hit some of the highlights. But it's interesting that throughout his discourse, which I basically categorize as now, as we all know, the well-familiar kind of neoliberal discourse of, he uses the word entitlement, right? And, entitlement has become a big political keyword in which somehow it's people like you and me are entitled, even though we pay our taxes and then we're getting part of those taxes that we pay for in return for whether it's Social Security or so forth. But somehow, corporations like General Electric, who make billions of dollars in revenues but don't pay any federal income tax in the U.S., somehow they are not labeled as being entitled. Okay, and it's also interesting right at the very end where he said, vote for capitalism when you can still vote, really equating, which has been a very dominant theme, and it's very difficult to disentangle the historical associations between capitalism and democracy, but in effect he's equating capitalism with democracy. The other thing I would mention is that if you notice that throughout his answer, he seemed to keep blaming people for the collapse of capitalism, right? And so he said, Detroit, when it was the capital of capitalism, without mentioning, of course, that it was, again, as the John Otis friend in the movie They Live, the automobile manufacturers who decided to outsource all the jobs out of Detroit to search of cheaper labor, which of course devastated the city. So I think that's kind of interesting where he kind of draws upon that kind of very strong neoliberal discourse of blaming people themselves for the collapse of capitalism, and that somehow with the implication, well, not even the implication, but quite blatantly saying that those who are voting against it are just kind of contributing it to the collapse of it. The next participant.
Organized society there is. How does it work for me in particular? Well, if you have all good habits and you work hard, stay straight, you'll have a better life.
And so you have a better life because of
Capitalism doesn't do anything for me. I do it for myself. I don't need somebody to tell me to do anything. I don't want anything from anybody. I'll rise on my own effort, as will everybody else. You know, a lot of people think the government should give them everything. Well, the government that gives you everything can take away everything. You know, the premise is a little kind of off. As a society, we have to be organized somehow. I mean, we're 350 million, wherever you're from. I mean, what are our choices? Communism, socialism, capitalism? Capitalism sucks the least out of all of them, put it that way. That's probably the fairest. Everything else is worse. Where else you want to go? Russia, Tehran, China, Cuba, North Korea, the workers' paradise? Maybe not. In my opinion, for whatever that's worth. Right? Quote me. Happy trails. And thank you.
I did quote him without his name, of course. I gotta say, I love this guy, okay? I love this guy because he's the kind of guy I grew up with in New York, okay? You know, if you hear his accent, his demeanor, his appearance, his body language, his facial expressions, his almost sneering, kind of skeptical FU look, that's the New York guy, street guy that I grew up with. And I think for me, it's, you know, part of what he says really kind of demonstrates that Gramsci's, you know, tension between the common and good sense, because a couple of things he says you cannot dispute. When he does say, well, you know, when you're comparing it with, yes, of course, Stalinist Russia, right, North Korea, I don't know how many people would say would voluntarily you know, migrate to North Korea over living in a country like Canada, Australia, or the US. So in that sense, you know, he's absolutely correct. There's a couple of things, though, that are intertwined there that make it very complex, where he says, one of the things he says, that capitalism is less destructive. Now, by what he means by destructive, that is the economic policies and practices that lower material and living standards for the majority of the people in a specific time frame, then I would agree that yes, capitalism in those instances have not been overly destructive. However, if we're looking at the global picture in terms of climate change and so forth, then perhaps one could argue. The other thing, this interesting thing he also talks about is the kind of fluctuation of the attribution of agency. When he first says capitalism works for everybody, but then a few moments later argues that capitalism doesn't do anything for me, I do it for myself, and he cites his own work habits, you know, and staying straight as the reasons why he has a good life in society. Another line that he said that I found very interesting kind of dialogically echoes Ronald Reagan's famous line when the participant says the government that gives you everything can take away everything. To me, that echoes President Ronald Reagan's famous line that government isn't the solution, government is the problem, which again is one of the central components of neoliberal discourse. Now, this thing, though, when he talks about that capitalism sucks the least of them, part of that is this kind of common sense thinking and framing. As I said before, most people were like, yeah, well, compared with, yeah, North Korea, you know, Stalinist Russia, yeah. However, what it does is it has the effect of really kind of shutting down any kind of meaningful discussion of alternative economies. That is to say, just because the and by the way, which we don't have time to go into, but the economists Richard Wolff and Stephen Resnick did an in-depth study of the economy of the Soviet Union from the 1920s until the 1960s, and basically their conclusion, based on mountains of empirical data and research, was that the Soviet Union was never communism, which, you know, most people would say, huh? It was actually state-run communism. So in place of the board of directors, as I talked about who the capitalists were appropriating surplus, you just basically replaced it with the Bolshevik party apparatchiks who were sitting around in a room and deciding on the surplus value. But what he does is basically shuts down any kind of meaningful exploration of how alternative ways we can organize our economy that doesn't necessarily mean to be labeled or lumped in with those totalitarian societies. But he frames it in this kind of street smart argument, which is, you know, for me, it's very appealing in some ways, and you could see how that would resonate with a lot of people. Okay, let's get on to the third one here. Oops. There.
False. Capitalism does not work for me. Why? So I guess on some level, I voted capitalism doesn't work, not just capitalism doesn't work for me. Why it doesn't work for me is, I think, pretty easy to evaluate, but why it doesn't work is a much bigger question. So why doesn't capitalism work for me? Student debt. Living in New York City and barely being able to get by, even in a stabilized apartment. Lack of jobs, lack of healthcare. Making basically 1970s minimum wage and being told that, you know, I'm lucky I even have a job doing anything remotely near what I want. When my dad was my age, so when my dad was 28, I was 2 years old. In this economy, in this very burgeoning capitalist economy, I can't even imagine having kids. So why doesn't capitalism work on a big scale is like what I was actually really thinking about when I came today. Capitalism doesn't work because it incentivizes nothing but money. It doesn't incentivize people. It doesn't incentivize well-being. It doesn't incentivize humanity. It incentivizes money and nothing else. And we're starting to see some of the results of what happens when your only metrics for goodness or functionality or efficiency, why is efficiency even a metric, is money. I can keep going endlessly. Just cut me off. Okay, cool. So, you know, in the past, this is a period of the greatest inequality since right before the Depression. Thank you, Robert Reich, for that fact. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work to have a very small group of people very, very rich and then a huge swath of people very poor. I mean, it's basically a recipe for a social revolution, which I think we've started having, and then perhaps a real revolution, which, you know, things aren't quite bad enough yet, but if the House Republicans get their way, they might be. I mean, what good is a society where a small group of people make an incredible amount of money and most everybody else can barely make it by? Is that the metrics on which we grade societies? Yeah, I guess to continue endlessly, if we look back at societies from the past that we value their politics and their art and their music and their literature and their creation and how well they took care of their people. If you were to look at American imperialist capitalist society today, how would it measure up by those things? What is the quality of life for people in this imperialist capitalist hellhole? Okay, cool, thanks. I rambled a little bit, but
Okay, I'm going to show the next participant and then talk about both.
No. Capitalism does not work for me. Well, for instance, my mother works in a company. She works all day. Sometimes she goes in on the weekends. Who gets all the money? We don't have any money. She's making all that money for somebody else who doesn't have to go in on the weekends. Yeah, anybody who work anywhere, they bust their ass, making tons of money for who? Themselves? I don't know any rich people. Thank you.
Okay, it's interesting that these last two participants, and part of that could be maybe attributed to the generational divide. I don't know. With the first participant, the young woman of 28, kind of categorized, and the man as well, perhaps as the so-called millennials, and which is very interesting because there's been poll after poll showing that majority of the millennial generation in the U.S. has been supporting the candidacy of Bernie Sanders. And I think that could be a kind of maybe a harbinger of things to come, or divide, so-called divide, in which the two participants before, the two older men, perhaps grew up in that kind of halcyon time of the 1945 to 1975 labor capital accord in the U.S., in which capital basically acceded to labor's demands, helped by the Roosevelt administration with the New Deal. That really enabled many Americans to kind of attain a middle-class lifestyle, but that started to fall apart in the late 70s and early 80s, accelerated that, of course, with Ronald Reagan. So it's kind of interesting now, the two younger participants have a very kind of almost searing critique of capitalism, particularly the second, the last participant, who I think is probably one of the most succinct and kind of parallel of that good sense way of street smart counter-argument to the second participant. So, kind of concluding this, is there this idea that, though, is there no alternative to capitalism? Frederick Jameson has provocatively written. Someone once said it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. We can now revise that and witness the attempt to imagine capitalism by way of imagining the end of the world. Mark Fisher said there is the widespread sense that not only is capitalism the only viable political and economic system, but also that it is now impossible to even imagine a coherent alternative to it. Okay, so where do we go from here? A part of this thing was that, part of the problem is that, critiques of capitalism, some scholars have said that critiques of capitalism themselves serve as renewal for capitalism itself, as in the following short 1-minute advertisement.
Occupy Wall Street. Get an edge by doing your research and trading with interactive brokers. Pay lower commissions. Get better stock loan rates, lower margin rates, better executions, transparent bond markets, more products at lower trading costs. Interactive brokers. Join the 1%.
Yes, yes. Madison Avenue is brilliant about that kind of thing. Thank you, Don Draper. How do we actually, prevent that kind of co-optation of those messages here? Part of this idea of what the 99%. One possible, this idea, this was from Dearborn in Michigan. Dearborn is a community in Michigan State in the U.S. in which 40% of the population is Arab American. And, of course, with the mainstream media discourses of, if you're Muslim, you must be, anti-Semitic. And here, this, picture kind of, plainly contradicts this. And so this idea that, again, this kind of, we're in the last 30, 40 years of the emphasis on identities around, whether it's racial, gender, ethnic, religious, and sexual, and so on, this idea of kind of class differences have been kind of obscured in some ways. And it really kind of, I think there's a seminal moment here in terms of which we were able to kind of address this now at this particular historical juncture. So the couple of questions I would raise in closing is, how can we utilize these discussions to be part of an activist critical public pedagogy? And then, importantly though, the ways in which this can engage with transforming common sense meaning making so that it does not take the form of an imposition of a superior worldview or understanding of the world originating outside the previously accepted common sense. So in the examples I gave of those two participants, I think the challenges would be to engage on their own terrains instead of just kind of dismissing them as like, you're typical kind of like Joe Schmo who doesn't know what he's talking about. In fact, they're narrating from their own lived experiences, and obviously the two of them were fortunate to be of a certain, social class, ethnic background, and so forth, and situated in that time where they were able to at least carve out a decent middle class lifestyle. So how do you actually engage with that in terms of their own lived experiences, right? In closing, this is something very important. I think that the late Marshall Berman, who passed away 2 years ago already, but he wrote the seminal All That Is Solid Melts into Air, the Experience of Modernity, in which he talks about, and then he got into this debate with, well, not really a debate, but a reply to Perry Anderson, who reviewed his book in the New Left Review. And in closing, I just want to quote this kind of something very important that Marshall Berman wrote, which he says, I think it's an occupational hazard for intellectuals, regardless of their politics, to lose touch with the stuff and flow of everyday life. But this is a special problem for intellectuals on the left because we, among all political movements, take special pride in noticing people, respecting them, listening to their voices, caring about their needs, bringing them together, fighting for their freedom and happiness. This is how we differ, or try to differ, from the world's assorted ruling classes and their ideologues who treat people they rule as animals or machines or numbers or pieces on a chessboard, or who ignore their existence completely, who dominate them all by playing them against each other, teaching them they can be free and happy only at each other's expense. Intellectuals can make a special contribution to this ongoing project. If our years of study have taught us anything, we should be able to reach out further, to look and listen more closely, to see and feel beneath surfaces, to make comparisons over a wider range of space and time, to grasp hidden patterns and forces and connections in order to show people who look and speak and think and feel differently from each other, who are oblivious to each other or fearful of each other, that they have more in common than they think. We can contribute visions and ideas that will give people a shock of recognitions of themselves and each other that will bring their lives together. This is what we can do for solidarity and class consciousness. But we can't do it. We can't generate ideas that will bind people's lives together if we lose contact with what those lives are like. Unless we know how to recognize people as they look and feel and experience the world, we'll never be able to help recognize themselves or change the world. Reading Capital won't help us if we don't also know how to read the signs in the street. Thank you.